Your opinion still the same about LAPD 52, which is the stain out in the driveway in the rear of the Bundy residence, that drop of blood, as it was when you saw the strips the first time you hybridized them?
Well, yes, but now I have checked it to make sure that that is the correct type. The 1.1, 1.2 is the correct type.
Okay, and this rehybridization process, is that something that another trained eye could do if they had any of the DNA?
Yes, that's something you could do with the PCR product.
Anyone who's conversant with the system?
Yes.
And you've already described there's quite a bit of PCR product around on these samples?
Well, there's on all these samples, I believe we still have PCR product left on all of them.
And would that be one way of confirming or refuting the results that you've produced here in court?
It would be one check, yes.
Okay, and we talked about the polymarker and D1S80 results. How do they support your initial and now confirmed opinion that 52 is a 1.1, 1.2?
Motion to strike with respect to polymorphs.
Sustain. Rephrase the question.
Do the cell mark polymarker DQ alpha results and your D1S80 results, excuse me,
Polymarker.
do the cell mark polymarker,
No polymarker.
cell mark results and your D1S80 results confirm your finding that the 1.3 was an artifact in light of the fact that...
It's vague. I think you're restricted to the D1S80
And the DQ alpha, Your Honor.
and the DQ alpha that cell mark did.
Do the cell mark RFLP and DQ alpha results and your D1S80 results confirm your initial opinion, which is confirmed on People's 274, that the 1.3 was an artifact in item 52?
Well, again, there's consistency in all those results.
And other trained eyes could disagree with you,
Yes.
but none have to your knowledge.
Sustain.
Mr. Scheck asked you a lot of questions about your sound scientific practice. Do you recall those a couple of days ago?
Yes.
Does that mean that the way you do things is the only way to do things?
No.
For example, you use a restriction enzyme HA3, cell mark uses HINF1.
Yes, that would be a difference.
So HA3 isn't the only sound scientific practice then?
That's correct.
What about extraction techniques? That's one of the initial steps in the process. You use the organic extraction process?
Yes, in this case, we use the organic extraction process. For example, there's a Chelex extraction process, and that's an acceptable practice.
Your Honor, I move to strike these questions as outside the scope of cross-examination in terms of these particular techniques. It's not what I asked about.
Overruled.
When you describe things as sound scientific practice, do you mean that any other way things are done is unsound?
No.
Have you always done things the way you do them now?
No.
For example, did you always flame your tools?
No.
Were you unsound before you flamed your tools?
I don't think so.
Why do you flame your tools?
Well, there's some things that you do in this business just because that shuts down anyone saying, well, why didn't you do that? Or what did you think about that? Or is it possible that you had something on there? And so there's certain steps that one can take to just eliminate any of those possibilities. And I've been involved in a case not too long ago, where it was inferred that the way I was cleaning my tools was insufficient. And so what I decided to do was to say, okay, let's remove that argument. Let's just burn these things.
To your personal knowledge, does Dr. Edward Blake flame his tools?
Sustain.
Even if an analyst wasn't as meticulous as you, if he follows the PCR DQ alpha user guide, including the use of positive, negative, and substrate controls, In your opinion, would those results be sound scientific results?
Move to strike with that foundation.
Overruled.
Yes, I think if one follows the user guide, that those would lead to sound results. Those are sound practices leading to good results.
Other sound practices?
Yes.
Mr. Scheck asked you some questions about your QA manual, your quality assurance manual.
Yes.
Recall those?
Yes.
Do you believe that the examiner should only should examine only one item of evidence at a time?
Yes.
In fact, that's what your QA manual says, is
Yes,
that
it
right?
does.
And do you believe that this practice of examining only one item of evidence at a time will guard against sample mix-up and cross-transfer?
Yes. It's a very important tool because that way you only have one thing in front of you that you're dealing with at any given moment when you're talking about examining a basic blood stain or swatches, for example.
And that's from your quality assurance manual.
Yes, that is.
Do you believe that reasonable care will be taken to ensure that the risk of inadvertent transfer between high and low DNA concentration samples, evidence and reference samples, and between victim and a suspect is minimized if you take reasonable care?
Yes.
And do you believe this may include only processing the samples at a different time or space and/or processing only a few samples at a time?
Yes, that's from our QA manual.
Is it that hard to do?
No, it's done routinely in laboratories all over the country.
Now, Mr. Scheck asked you several days ago about a 7-day period from start to finish with some of your evidence processing through typing. Do you recall that series of events and questions?
Yes, I believe that was from sometime in August.
Okay. And now, in that context, I'd like to actually describe what you did versus what you normally do. Okay, Mr. Sims?
Okay.
Did that 7 days represent the fastest period of time within which those complete set of tests could have been performed?
By no means. In fact, it was September now. I remember it was a series of days in September. But I think what that would represent was about the slowest it could ever take to do that series of tests.
Okay, and why was it so slow?
Well, we were being extremely methodical as far as sampling this evidence. We were documenting each part of the process.
Can you just be specific as to which samples? Because I asked him about a few.
Yes.
Sure, could we focus on what the series of questions that this was about? Do you recall the dates?
Yes, it began, I believe, on September 8th.
And you recollect what items we were testing?
Well, again, I'm going to have to refer to my notes to refresh my memory. Is there a question in front of me?
Sure, which items
Yes.
did that sequence or that series represent, Mr. Sims?
That would be item number 47, item number 1, item number 20, item number 14, item number 15, item number 16, item number 17, item number 18, item number 19, item number 20, item number 26, I think that's, well, no, there were some additional items there. Item number 293, item number 305,
Mr. Sims, are you going back and forth between your DOJ numbers and the LAPD numbers on us?
oh, I'm sorry, I'm doing that, yes.
Could we get them in terms of LAPD numbers?
Well, no, actually, I don't. Yes, I'm sorry, I did do that. I mentioned 47, I mentioned 1, 20, 24, 29, 30, 31, 32, 34, 55, 293, 305, I think that's it for those samples.
Well, what took so long that you don't normally do in the processing of these samples?
Well, I think you begin by the fact that anytime you have a guest in the laboratory, that automatically adds a certain amount of time to the process.
Is that unusual?
No, I mean, there's a certain level of hello, how are you, and all that kind of thing that always goes on. But more to the point would be that the documentation would be twofold. In other words, I would take a photograph, and then Dr. Blake would take a photograph, and then I'd stop and make sure he had taken his photograph before I moved on to do my next step, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a long part of the process. And that would include just the actual sampling of these items. In other words, to get it out of that coin envelope, documented, photographed, et cetera, and then put into a test tube for later testing.
What about the weighing of samples? Did that take place during this sequence?
Yes, this was something that I had never done before in a case where I actually weighed the swatches, individually weighing them. And, you know, as you can imagine, one has to be very careful because you're starting to now handle the evidence in an unusual way, and so you have to make sure that that goes right, and that takes time.
Having never done this before and adding a new step in the sample processing, does that increase the likelihood or possibility of some sort of problem?
Well, anytime you excessively handle things, it makes me nervous, but I just had to slow things down to make sure that we didn't lose one of these, for example. In other words, one didn't fly off the forceps or something like that and land on the floor. That would be the kind of concern that I would have.
And is there anything in your protocol about weighing samples?
No.
How much additional time do you think this weighing, double documentation, double photographing contributed to the process?
Well, I mean, to the whole, it's hard for me to say exactly, but it would at least double, maybe triple the amount of time that I'd spend, something like that. I don't know exactly.
Okay. Now, I believe you mentioned that you did the organic extraction process.
Yes,
And Kelex, you mentioned earlier, that's a much faster process?
yes. The Kelex extraction can be done in a matter of a couple hours. The organic, for one thing, would take overnight, and then there's a lot more processing down afterwards.
Okay, and there's another step called a product gel,
Yes,
and do you usually do that before the final product or the typing is conducted?
usually, but not always.
Okay, sometimes you do it afterwards.
Yes, sometimes I do it afterwards.
If you do it afterwards, then you can start from sampling to typing in a shorter period of time?
Yes, because it's one step that you do later, so you could have a typing result and then just do that later.
And is that sound scientific practice to do it afterwards, just as it is to do it before?
I have no problem with that.
Okay. And I believe in this sequence you also did a slot blot, did you?
Yes, I believe it was, a slot blot was run on these samples, yes, and that was by Renee Montgomery.
And how much time does the slot blot contribute to this entire 7-day period?
Well, overall, that would probably add about a day's worth of work to this, because there was the preparation of the slot block, then it's got to be hived, and you do the actual test, and then there was the documentation of it. For example, Dr. Blake would come over and review all of our results, so we would spend time figuring out what the quantities were, and then we'd review all that stuff. So that takes a lot of time.
So is there any way to compare how long you took in that 7-day process with someone else who's trying to exonerate or implicate someone else in short order?
I don't think it's a fair comparison.
Let's talk about the EAP marker specifically as it relates to the fingernail scrapings.
Okay.
On direct examination, you briefly referred to scientific literature about the EAP system. Could you just briefly summarize general concerns about the EAP system?
Yes, briefly, this is,
Counsel, haven't we been through this with this witness on direct and with Mr. Matheson? I mean, the jury has heard the concerns about
I've got a few
EAP.
questions. Mr. Scheck went into it on cross, Your Honor.
I understand that, but I'm saying I don't think the foundation is necessarily required at this point. The jury has already heard this discussed 3 times now.
I'm sorry, Your Honor.
That's the
I'm
point I'm trying to make.
sorry. You've reviewed Mr. Matheson's notes, and you've reviewed his electrophoretic. It's marked as Peoples 273 for identification, have you not?
yes, I have.
Okay. And you're aware of the number of samples that are on there?
Yes, I am.
Could you, from left to right, read the number of evidence samples that are on that electrophoretic?
80,
Overruled.
84A, 84B, 85A, 85B, 115, 116, and 117.
Okay. And reviewing 84A and B, which purport to be from the fingernail scrapings of Nicole Brown taken during the autopsy process, how would you report the EAP type for 84A and B?
Objection beyond the scope of cross-examination. Only asked about degradation of
Overruled.
Well, I mean, this is somewhat difficult because obviously I'm not the one that read the original plate, but I think if you look at this particular set of results, you do see that some of these samples have their A bands starting to fade away. I can see consistency in that. And I also note that in that critical area of the plate on the left side where 84A and B are, there is some distortion in the gel. And I don't think you can definitely say that that's a B result. That would be my conclusion.
What would you say?
Well, I recognize that there are the bands. I see some bands there that you could say, may be attributable to a B. In other words, it's not an A, for example. There's no doubt in my mind that it's not an A result. But I don't think you can absolutely say that that's a B either.
Okay. Would you look at 117?
Okay?
What's that look like?
Cross.
Sustained.
May we approach on that?
117 was not an issue discussed.
Well,
Proceed.
May we approach, Your Honor?
No, proceed.
Is 115 and 116 also on that electrophoretic?
Yes.
Would you exclude Nicole Brown as the source of the blood under her nails now that you've explained to the jury what you think 84A and B look like? If you assume that she was an EAP type BA.
Well, I'm not looking at this result just in that vacuum of the particular gel. I mean, I'm taking into account the information that we've derived from the PCR results, and I'm also taking into account my understanding that there was no indication of any tissue was found on this sample. So from that those to me are powerful pieces of information because it indicates that this is not just some isolated sample, but this would be part of that entire mix that was looked at by the PCR testing, which included Nicole Brown, and so I would not use this to exclude her.
Okay. And I believe your description of what you see some possible A bands there. Is that consistent with the primary scientific literature that Mr. Scheck referred to on cross-examination?
Sustain, rephrase the question.
Are your observations about seeing something in the A band area consistent with the mainstream scientific literature on the subject?
Vague objection as to where.
Overruled.
Well, my concern was that key area where the most stable A band is not really very...
Mr. Sims, the question was, is that consistent with what you have seen in the scientific literature on the subject? Yes or no?
I'm sorry, is what
Rephrase the question, counsel.
Okay. You've told the jury you would not describe that as a B. You've told the jury that you see something in the A band area, knowing the degradation process of a EAP type BA, and seeing what you see in the A band area. Is your observation consistent with a BA degrading to a B based on the mainstream scientific literature on that point?
Vague as to that question.
Overruled.
Well, my concern, I think that misstates what I said somewhat about seeing some A bands there. My concern is that critical area is not where the A band would be. One of the key A bands would be is not that clear from this particular result. So that is consistent with the scientific literature that one of those A bands is more stable than the other.
Okay. I'd like to talk about, what time are we going to break, Your Honor?
3:30.
3:30, okay. 3:30. I'd like to talk about Dr. Blake and his presence in your lab a little bit more. Mr. Scheck elicited from you that you frequently change gloves between samples in this case. Do you remember that last week?
Yes.
Did Mr. Blake's involvement in this case have some impact on you changing gloves between samples?
Yes, it did.
Could you explain at each point in the process why Mr. Blake's involvement caused you to change gloves in this case between samples?
Yes. When we were processing these samples, one of the activities that I mentioned was weighing of the swatches. So that meant that for each one of these, I had to go one at a time around different areas of the laboratory. And I was particularly concerned about having handled doorknobs and touching different things as far as what that may potentially be on my gloves. So I would contrast that with the situation where you're just working with clean tools, then it's unlikely that you would get any contamination on your gloves, where you're just working in one area. And it was because of the request for the weighing of the swatches that would necessitate, or would make me want to be more concerned about how those, about the changing of gloves.
So would you actually, with each sample that was taken, would you then go take it and be weighed and photographed individually?
Yes, it would be taken to another room for photography, and then taken to another room for weighing, and then brought back into the main laboratory area where I was working.
And is that why you change gloves between samples?
Well, that was one of the key concerns in my case because I was handling a lot of different surfaces at that point.
Okay, now, so it's not your practice then to routinely change gloves between every sample that you're processing in a case, in a normal case?
That's correct.
Okay, and is your practice consistent with the Amplotype PCR DQ Alpha user guide?
Yes, it is.
In that regard, do you change gloves frequently to avoid sample-to-sample contamination?
Yes.
And do you change them whenever they might have been contaminated with DNA and whenever exiting the work area?
Yes, whenever I would think that I may have contaminated my gloves, I would immediately take them off.
Do you recognize that language from section 2.2.2 of the user guide?
Yes, I'm familiar with that.
Is it that hard to do?
No.
You ever had Dr. Blake take photos of you in a case before?
We've been involved in several cases over the years. I can't recall one where he took photos of me, as opposed to photos of the evidence.
Okay. Did your examination of the glove number 9 from Rockingham take a long time in this case?
Yes, it did.
Do you recall how long it took?
Well, I think that was on this Sunday, as I recall. Actually, it was a weekend. It was a good part of a weekend was spent on that glove initially, and then there was an additional examination in, I believe, in November of the glove.
And did you engage in the documentation practice that you've described, where you took photos and weighed things and have Dr. Blake take his own photos?
Well, in that case now, we didn't weigh anything from the glove, but there was the kind of documentation that you mentioned.
Why were those samples not weighed?
We were not asked to do that by the defense.
How did that come about that you weighed samples for the first time in this case?
Dr. Blake told me that the defense wanted,
I have no idea what he's going to say next, but I stipulate we asked them to weigh the samples.
Right. Pursuant to a defense request?
yes, pursuant to a defense request.
Okay, let's talk about the glove exam just for a moment while we're talking about the glove. Why did you look in the notch area?
Yes, this was after looking over a lot of the,
Or will?
well, the way this came about was I started thinking about how someone with a bloody finger might want to take a glove off and use that notch to do it.
Strike is speculation.
Sustain.
Your attention to the notch on the glove.
There was a small amount of stain down in that area.
And had you already sampled the glove in other areas?
Yes, I had.
Had you done testing in those other areas?
Well, I didn't have any results at that point. I had just taken samples from other areas.
Okay, and then you mentioned there were some small stains in that area?
Yes, there was a small stain in particular that caught my eye.
And where was that?
That was down by that notch.
And why was that of significance to you?
Form of the question.
Overruled.
Well, there were a lot of stains on that glove to look at, but I again, that's why I looked in that particular area, was because I thought there may be some significance to one taking a glove off and using the notch to do that.
Overruled.
Could we get the glove photo board and the glove result board up there? Put the result board up. 272A and B, put the result board up first, please. Mr. Sims, could you show us the, thank you. I think you've described your attention being drawn to the notch. What drew your attention, or what stains are we talking about that drew your attention to the notch area of the glove from Rockingham number 9?
Well, and this again would be from my notes on page 71. I noted an area on the inner surface with the notch that showed what I said was macro interest, and that means that I saw there was some of that blood, small amount of blood staining down in that G10 area. And I also noted what I thought was, and then I looked at it under the stereo microscope, and I thought there looked like a possible piece of tissue in that area.
Okay. And why was that of interest to you?
Well,
Well,
because tissue is normally something that's produced by, for example, a wound as opposed to just blood by itself.
And why was the notch area of interest to you?
Well, again, from I guess this is my training and just common sense and all that goes into it, but I started thinking about where blood...
Counsel, I think we've asked this question now 4 times.
I'm not sure we got an...
Yes, we did. We got an answer.
And Mr.
And we
Sims,
also have to trust the common sense of the jurors about how one takes gloves off and how one puts them on.
okay, Mr. Sims, just to kind of summarize here where we are with the glove, could you show the jury where the stains are located that are consistent with Mr. Sims as one of the contributors? Could you?
With
I mean,
Mr.
Mr.
Sims?
Simpson. Mr. Simpson. Well, we don't know his type, you know.
All right.
Could you show us where they are on the photo board?
On the...
On the
Which-
photo board.
Oh, I'm
the
sorry, I
Rocky-
couldn't see it from my
Oh,
angle.
I'm sorry.
You may have to move that over here so all the jurors can see what you're talking about, because it's pretty subtle what's there. And if you could, Mr. Perlow, could you move that up so 1492 and 165 aren't blocked by the podium? All right, Mr. Harmon?
Okay, Mr. Sims, could you just point out the 3 different areas that you found a mixture consistent with Mr. Simpson on the glove?
Okay, again, I just want to review and make sure I got those numbers correct. Yes, it's 10 up here. This is the one I was talking about. It's near the notch. It's actually down a little bit closer than the red shows. There's a stain down in this area. This was, 9 was where I thought I saw the possible tissue. And then 11 is on the outside of the glove, to the side of the notch there, down towards the wrist area. And then 13 was along the actual stitching of that notch.
Okay. Now, while you're there, and I've got some photos if you need to have your recollection refresh, but of those 3 stains that had the 25 allele, which could have been contributed by Mr. Simpson, but not Mr. Goldman, not Ms. Brown, were any of those close to cutout areas that were on that glove when you first saw it?
The only one that at all comes to mind to me would be this cutout here is somewhat close to.
Could you describe, you pointed to it, could you relate it to one of the other markings on the board?
Yes, the cutout here near G14. In other words, G14 is down in this area. There's a cutout above it. That somewhat opposes, now when it's right side out, it would somewhat oppose this area on G10.
And the other two stains that had the 25 allele were not close to any areas that appeared to have been cut out?
I wouldn't describe them as being close.
Okay, could you just tell the jury, when I say areas that were cut out, tell us what the glove looked like when you got it?
Well, when I got it, it appeared to me that cutouts had been made from the different areas, some of the different areas along the glove. In other words, I didn't know exactly who cut them out, but it appeared that there were some sort of squarish cutouts made in different areas of the glove.
And were those consistent with having been sampled by a forensic scientist?
That's typically what I would expect to see.
Okay, thank you. I have no further questions. Can we take a break now?
All right, ladies and gentlemen.
I have more questions, but
Not
not
on-
before the break.
not on this, all right.
subject.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a 15-minute recess. Please remember all my admonitions to you. Don't discuss the case amongst yourselves, form any opinions about the case, conduct any deliberations, or allow anybody to communicate with you, and we'll recess for 15. Mr. Sims, you can step down. We could finish, too, you know. Hold them. All right, what's the relevance of 117? It was not gone into on cross.
Well, 117 was gone into extensively on cross, and this is part of the large picture on 117. As everybody knows now, EAP is in the red cells.
Refresh my recollection. What is 117?
117 is the rear gate stain.
Got it.
It's
Okay.
one of the EDTA stains. We all know the significance of that. That's one of the stains that wasn't collected till July 3rd. We all know that EAP's in the red cells, DNA's in the white cells, and the defense contentions about 117 are that it's planted, and remember this great chart that shows
The
how
amount of DNA.
how much
Yes.
more DNA is in there. Well, that's just the white blood cells. The red blood cells, the conventional serology, and the EAP is right on that electrophoretogram. So remember, Mr. Simpson is an EAP type BA, and that's not what 117 typed to. It typed to, as I recall, a B inconclusive or a B question mark. And what Mr. Sims, if I'm allowed to do, and this is part of the large picture in discussing and demonstrating irrefutably that 117 wasn't planted, the fact that Mr. Simpson's EAP type has changed, just like Ms. Brown's did, from a BA to a B, The fact that the conventional serology results by Mr. Matheson show no PGM activity from 117, and Mr. Sims is going to discuss PGM literature. PGM is a much more persistent marker than EAP is. These all demonstrate totally conclusively that that stain, 117, was out there for a long period of time. That we'll be discussing scientific literature about PGM to show how it persists in spite of a large number of environmental insults. And the EAP electrophoretograms, it's right on there. And if you recall back, this goes back some weeks ago, the defense made a big deal in one of these exhibits. They wanted us to cut off 117. This is weeks and weeks ago. I can't even remember which exhibit that was. Because they just don't want the jury to see that Mr. Simpson's EAP type went from a BA to a B inconclusive, just like Nicole Brown's did in the fingernail clippings. So this is a small piece of the big picture that shows that 117 was out there for some period of time that's consistent with having been out there since June 13th. I need to supplement that a little bit too. That same electrophoretogram has 115 and 116 on there. 115, 116, and 117 all produce the same conventional serology results. This BA looks like a B. It looks like a degraded BA. It's a B inconclusive, very much like what Mr. Sims has described 84A and B are. No PGM activity. And let's not forget what we know about 115, and I'll bring that up again at the close of the business today, too, Your Honor. We've got a photograph taken on June 13th.
No, let's not go into that.
Well, that's
We're only
part.
talking
That's all
about-
part. It's all
No.
part of the picture.
We're only talking about whether or not I'm going to allow you on redirect to go back into 117, and it had been my recollection erroneously that that had not been covered in 117, had not been covered in the cross-examination, and I stand corrected. Yes.
It was only covered with respect to the DNA concentration and what, first of all,
Well, what's the inference that you're going to argue from that?
the inference is with respect to the amount of DNA in that stain, and that's it. What Mr. Harmon is trying to do,
But wait, the inference that you're going to argue from that is that it is different than the DNA on 47, 48, 49, 50, and 52.
amounts,
Yes.
yes, and that's what the chart depicts.
Right.
But Mr. Harmon's made a series of...
And what argument are you going to make from that point?
That's the argument
What's
that-
the relevance to it?
It has to do with the relative age of the drops. There's no question about that. But
Okay. All right.
he's made two different arguments here. And the first is, and let's sort them through because it is outside the scope of the cross in this regard. The first is that there is the 117 is typed inconclusive. It has nothing to do with B. It's just period inconclusive by Matheson. So it seems to me that it's improper and outside the scope of certainly cross-examination to be raising 117 in the context of the fingernail scrapings at this point in time when that wasn't gone into. And again, it's an inconclusive. Mr. Harmon is talking about PGM now with respect to this stain and how that might relate to the age of the stains. And I think that again is outside the scope of the cross-examination. But certainly using 117 to go back into the issue of the appearance of a B when it wasn't called a B, it was an inconclusive, and to go back into the fingernail scrapings has nothing to do with the cross-examination on that point. As to what he's saying he wants to do with this electrophoretogram on the conventional serology markers, I don't know. It sounds like it's outside the scope there too. And if And that's about all I have to say about that. But it's plainly beyond the scope with respect to what he's doing right now, and that's discussion of the fingernail scrapings. We didn't go into that at all. And we didn't go into that at all, and it wasn't even gone into with Mr. Matheson.
All right, well, the
117.
issue is
So-
117 and the age of the blood drop.
That's right.
Mr.
Red
Harmon?
blood cells, white blood cells, they're within the same cell, and they want to, I mean, you talk about something being beyond the scope. We're talking about the same cell, and they want to preclude me from talking about implications of red cell testing by saying we only talked about white blood cell testing, and I think that's clearly a silly proposition, Your Honor, to confine me. We're talking about 117. We're talking about how long 117 was there. We're talking about whether it was planted. We're talking about the ambient environment that it was in, as opposed to all the things along the walkway in the house. That's what we're going to be talking about with this witness, Your Honor, and that's all within the scope of that beautiful chart that they put up there. It's within the scope of that chart.
The other answer to this is that if they want to make some inferences about, they just had this witness testify that he disagrees with the call that Mr. Matheson made on the EAPB under the fingernails, that he wouldn't have called it a B. Now what they're trying to do is have him testify about these test results in another context with respect to the gate when he's not the person that performed these tests, has expressed reservations about the results of these tests. He's the wrong witness. If they want to call a witness to testify about this particular testing and lay a foundation for it in relation to the gate and how conventional markers can or cannot tell you anything about the age of the blood on the gate, then they can call a witness to testify to it. But it's outside the scope of the cross-examination, and it's without foundation as to this witness, as to these tests, which he's disavowed. He wants him to start testifying about results which this witness has disavowed. He disagreed with the call on the fingernail scrapings, and now he wants him to testify about the significance of the back gate, which was called inconclusive, which ordinarily, in fact, this witness has said that inconclusives, he won't testify, report the results.
Mr. Scheck, hold on. Mr. Harmon, your offer of proof is that you're going to ask Mr. Sims to testify to the durability of PGM markers in blood left at crime scenes.
Right. And, I mean, we're only at the point now we're talking about EAP. And so we haven't gotten beyond that with 117. You can look at this thing, and it looks just like 84A and B. And that's what Mr. Sims is going to say. The EAP result looks just like 84A and B. Now, if this is planted, unless somebody took Mr. Simpson's red blood cells from this stain, that gets much more complicated if that's what's going to do.
No, Mr. Harmon, please don't launch off into things that I'm not asking you about. I'm asking you, are you making an offer of proof
Yes, Your Honor.
that you're going to then go into the durability of the PGM marker?
Right, and the fact that there was no PGM activity in these stains.
And that's going to tell me that it's been out there for a long time.
Yes, Your Honor.
All right.
My objection is to, if he's restricting it that way, that's one thing, although I still think it's outside the scope. But I don't want him doing this with respect to the fingernail scrapings in this context, because I didn't go into it in that context on cross-examination, and it's going to open up a whole can of worms that...
All right. I understand this argument to be in the context of 117, the stain out by the gate. All right.
115, they're all in the same electrophotogram. Yeah.
All right. The issue was raised regarding the age of the stain on the gate. I will allow limited access by the prosecution on redirect to that issue. All right? I'm not willing to try the rest of the case on this.
But I still have a remaining objection that he didn't even do these tests.
I understand that.
And has said that, he's asking him to talk about an inconclusive.
And I anticipate that a foundation will be laid. But you did bring up the issue of the age
On
of the
the amount of DNA, that's fine, but this is an apples and oranges issue.
No, it's the issue that's relevant to the case.
No, I have no quarrel with putting in such testimony through the
All right.
competent witness with a proper foundation, but
Let's
that
have
hasn't
the
been
jurors.
done.
redirect examination by Mr. Harmon. Mr. Harmon, you may continue.
Thank you, Your Honor. Do you have the electrophoretogram in front of you, Mr. Sims, that's got 84A and B and 117 on it?
Yes, I have a photograph of the EAP results, and
Sure.
also I have some photos of the PGM results.
And you've reviewed Mr. Sims' records on the testing for 117?
Mr. Matheson.
I'm sorry, Mr. Matheson.
Yes, I have reviewed that.
What is your opinion about the EAP type of 117?
Objection, no foundation.
Overruled.
Well, about the actual type, I think that is an inconclusive result, although yes, I think that's an inconclusive result. It looks similar to this.
Overruled. Overruled.
I would just say it's an inconclusive result.
Does it look similar to 84A and B?
Sustained.
How does it compare to 84A and B?
Sustained. Not allowing that, counsel.
Excuse me, Your Honor?
I'm not allowing that.
What bands do you see there?
On 117,
Yes.
I see what we would call the B and C bands. There's a possibility of some activity in the closer A band, but it's smeared in that area.
Okay. If the stain in item 117 is actually from the defendant, Mr. Simpson, and his EAP type is a BA, how do you compare the fact that he's a BA with what you see in the electrophoretogram?
Objection, no foundation.
Overruled.
I wouldn't exclude him based on this result if he is a BA.
Why not?
Well, because again, I don't think the pattern is that clear that you can rule out a BA on that particular result.
Would it be fair to say that that stain has been there for some time simply based on the appearance of the bands?
Objection, no foundation.
Sustained.
Are you familiar with the scientific literature on the degradation of the EAP marker?
Yes.
Are you familiar with how long it persists in different conditions?
Yes, I have some familiarity with that.
What can you say about the length of time, the results that you see for 117 on the electrophoretogram, that stain was in the position that it was removed from?
Well, with that EAP result by itself, it would be difficult to give much of an estimate on that result alone.
Okay. We'll talk about PGM in a little bit. Let's talk about substrate control processing. You've shown us some of the results which show no typing results on the DQ alpha strips that we saw earlier this afternoon.
Yes.
What I'd like to do is address the processing of substrate controls in three areas: sample mixing in the field, cells from investigators or lab personnel contamination, or in-lab contamination via amplified PCR product, commonly known as PCR product carryover. Okay?
Okay.
Do you agree that the presence of contaminant is often readily apparent?
Yes,
And why is that?
because it shows itself, for example, where it comes through in your control samples, or you may see a lot of additional bands, not bands, but dots in samples that shouldn't have additional dots.
And if so, do you believe that appropriate controls should be used that would indicate those situations?
Yes, I do.
And do you believe that negative controls, including extraction reagent blanks and unstained substrate controls, when possible, should be run for each batch of DNA isolations?
Yes,
Do you also believe that the absence of a PCR product in these control reactions attests to the validity of the typing results derived from the evidence samples?
yes, I do.
And have you relied on an article by Cecilia von Beryl-Dingen and Dr. Blake that we alluded to on direct examination?
Now, that is the one in PCR technology, I believe?
That's correct. It's a chapter in a book. I believe it's chapter 17.
Yes, I have.
And do you recognize the statements I read to you as coming from that chapter that you relied on by Dr. Blake and Cecilia von Beryl-Dingen?
That sounds like the language of that chapter, yes.
Okay. Now, Mr. Scheck asked you numerous questions about handling of substrate controls. Do you recall that in the beginning of your direct examination?
Yes.
And do you recall him using the word handling in parallel, with the emphasis on the parallel?
Yes.
Now, is there a difference between systematic handling of substrate controls in parallel in the evidence processing phase and processing those substrate controls in the same manner during the DNA typing process?
No, I think we're talking about the same basic process of alternating between stain and substrate control, stain and substrate control.
Now, do you have any scientific problem with not processing substrate controls in some instances along with the stains which they were collected alongside?
Now, specifically, you would say at the point where you're doing the amplifications?
Yes.
No.
And why, would you explain to the jury why, in your opinion, it is not a problem not to have gotten substrate controls after you had typed some of the evidence stains?
Oh, well, again, it's just a matter of you can, depending on what you're going to use the substrate controls to infer, as long as they're typed at some point, that tells you that through that process of collection and how they were initially handled in the laboratory, that there's no problem with those processes. In other words, you didn't induce some contamination in those.
And are you missing anything by not processing for typing those substrate controls at the same time you type the evidence stains?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. But let's revert back to the evidence processing in the very beginning when, for example, stains are processed for drying. Is it critical that substrate controls be processed in parallel or systematically alternating between an evidence stain and a substrate control?
Well, again, if you're going to use it as a control in that process, then I would say yes to that. In other words, you want to do one and then the other.
And how is it a control in that context?
Because, again, if anything is likely to show a type of contamination, it's a sample that would be blank in the first place, so that all you have is contamination. So the substrate control is the key because you're alternating those between the stains, and so if there was something from this stain contaminating, it should then contaminate the substrate control.
Is it somewhat of a barrier?
Yes, I think it provides a little buffer between each one of your stains.
Okay, and if one also were to simply process one stain at a time in addition to alternating between the evidence stain and the substrate control, would that provide an additional safeguard
Yes, it would.
against sample mix-up?
Yes, it would.
Okay, now that's the first category, sample mix-up, either in collection or processing within the lab. Let's move to contamination by investigators or lab personnel. What is the role that a substrate control plays in that process?
The substrate control can play the role of showing that it was in an area that was nearby. For example, when we talked about all this sneezing and coughing, that's an area that was nearby the stain, and so there's no evidence then, assuming it comes up negative, there's no evidence then that that kind of contamination occurred on that particular sample.
Now, is there any scientific basis for the notion that a sneezing investigator, his sneezes will only go on evidence stains and not on substrate controls?
I've never heard of that.
Okay, now I know the FBI, they didn't do sneezing in their study, right?
That's my understanding.
Has anybody ever done any research into any aversion biological material might have to these blank substrate controls?
Well, we have studied swatches that are blank. I mean, after all, it is a blank swatch that is used, it starts out blank, that's used to soak up a stain. So they certainly have an affinity for biological material, these swatches do.
Okay, and the third area that you discussed on direct examination, in-lab contamination, PCR product carryover. Are there two areas of controls or two different sets of controls in this context that safeguard against contamination?
Yes, there are.
And what are they?
Well, again, there are the controls that the substrate controls offer, and then there are also the controls that, such as the extraction reagent blank, the negative amplification control. Those are all important controls.
And if those controls all test negative, what does that tell you about in-lab contamination?
Well, it gives you confidence in your results because you would then see no evidence that you have in-lab contamination.
Okay, and are your tests designed to detect that if it exists?
Yes, in other words, we're constantly monitoring for that situation. We're not just taking steps to avoid it, but we're using these controls as a way of monitoring it to see whether or not it may actually occur.
So in this context, if the evidence stain would be contaminated, there's no or you would expect the substrate control to be contaminated.
If you have a general contamination problem, then you would expect all those to be affected.
Okay. Is there any scientific reason you can think of why PCR product carryover would avoid substrate controls or negative controls?
Is there any scientific reason I can think of? No, again, you look at the totality of the results, and no, I think the answer to that question is just no, there's no.
Okay, Mr. Scheck asked you about amplicons, remember that?
Yes,
And you admitted that about 100 units might be enough to produce a detectable or typable contaminant.
something like that, yes.
Now, do these amplicons, do they go out in like military units of 100 unit sizes when they go out?
Objection. Argumentative to the form.
Sustain, rephrase the question.
Are these amplicons disciplined?
Not to my knowledge.
Objection, motion to strike.
Overruled.
Are some of them left?
Is there any molecular affinity that these things have? Any bonding affinity that these things have?
The only time you have any affinity would be when they're all in a droplet, for example, but once they're dispersed, they're dispersed.
And you could see it drop, if it's big enough.
It would be you could have a very small drop, but you could see that type of spot. Yes, it's extremely small.
And if one of these 100 amplicons went out in the environment somewhere, that's the minimum detectable amount that you'd have to produce a typable result.
Approximately, that's an approximation.
But they'd all have to end up on the same place.
Well, they'd all have to end up in the same test tube is what I think the point was.
Okay, Mr. Sims, I want to ask you a series of questions about your laboratory practices and how the presence of substrate controls and negative controls play a role, okay? I want you to assume...
This is asked and answered, Your Honor. I think we've been over this 4 times now.
Should start again.
Let's assume all the substrate controls and negative controls produce no typing results, okay?
Okay.
Is the subject of sample-to-sample cross-contamination adequately addressed even if the forensic scientist does not change gloves between samples?
Yes.
Why is that?
Well, because again, the controls serve as a way of checking out your system. And you look at the totality of the results, and if all those controls came out negative, then the inference would have to be that the stains were properly typed.
Okay, same assumption. Is the subject of sample-to-sample cross-contamination adequately addressed if those controls produce no typing results, even if the forensic scientist does not change gloves between different scenes from different sources of people?
I think we've been over this in every context.
Overruled. Not specific,
And
not
I would
specifically.
object to the term adequately address as being vague.
Overruled.
Yes, it does adequately address that.
Okay, same conditions. Is the subject of sample-to-sample cross-contamination adequately addressed even if the forensic scientist does not handle the reference sample in a different room than he handles the evidence stains?
Again, provided you have all those controls, I would say yes, it does adequately address that.
Same assumptions. Is the subject of sample-to-sample cross-contamination adequately addressed even if the forensic scientist does not handle evidence from separate crime scenes in a different room?
Yes.
And the same conditions. Is the subject of sample-to-sample cross-contamination adequately addressed even if the forensic scientist does not avoid handling multiple samples during the same period of time?
Yes.
Same assumptions. Is the subject of sample-to-sample cross-contamination adequately addressed even if the forensic scientist does not completely prevent aerosol of any type?
Yes, again, provided that you've got all those substrate controls working in a negative fashion, I would agree with that.
Okay, tell us about aerosol and these substrate controls and negative controls. Why would that be a safeguard?
Well, because an aerosol is a generally dispersed phenomenon, and so you would expect, if there's contamination, you would expect it to land on the various items all that were anywhere in a certain proximity.
If the controls all test negative, is the subject of sample-to-sample cross-contamination adequately addressed, even if the forensic scientist does not change paper between samples?
Yes,
Is the subject addressed, even if the forensic scientist does not flame his tweezers or tools?
yes,
Is the subject addressed, even if the forensic scientist doesn't stratolink his lab notes?
yes,
Now, you do stratolink your lab notes, right?
yes,
But now you end up going back into the laboratory where DNA is prepared at some point, right?
yes, I remove a lab coat and go back in there, yes,
But it's the same hairdo,
yes,
same clothing.
yes,
You don't stratolink yourself before you go back there, do you?
no,
Do the substrate controls and negative controls provide an adequate safeguard against you bringing DNA back in the lab that's been amplified in PCR product?
yes, again, I think you're talking about the body of all those controls, yes,
And does the, assume all the controls are negative, is the subject of sample-to-sample cross-contamination adequately addressed even if the forensic scientist does not have a laminar flow hood?
yes.
Mr. Sims, what combination of events would have had to have occurred in order to allow cross-contamination between, let's say, Rockingham stain number 12 and all of the Bundy walkway stains, which would have allowed you to type the Bundy stains to give Rockingham types, the types that were
Objection
originally at
calls for
Rockingham?
speculation.
In other words, this would be to get the same typing result on the Bundy stains, no results on the substrate controls, and those Bundy stain results would be the same types as found on the Rockingham stains. Is that the hypothetical?
Right, and no results from Bundy.
And no results from, I'm sorry, and no.
No results from what was there originally at Bundy.
Oh, okay. Well, there'd have to be a lot of things going on. The Bundy results would have to have totally degraded. The Bundy stains, I'm sorry, would have to have totally degraded. And then somehow this contamination would have to sort of play a game of hopscotch and miss these substrate controls and just hit on the stains.
And what about your ability to still type the Rockingham stains?
Well, in other words, if all the DNA had gone from the Rockingham, I mean, it's not really conceivable to me that that would happen.
Okay. How likely are these things to have happened to all of the Bundy stains that you processed?
I think this foundation goes beyond anything suggested in cross-examination.
Based on your review of the scientific literature, your examination of these stains, both the Rockingham and Bundy stains, your familiarity with the conventional serology results in this case, do you have an opinion about how likely only the Bundy walkway stains were totally degraded, so degraded to produce no typing, that there was a transfer from the Rockingham stains?
Let me save you the trouble.
Sure.
I'm going to sustain the objection because I think it calls for speculation. The jury knows what the conditions are, and the likelihood is for them to determine.
Okay. Mr. Sims, I want to ask you a couple of hypotheticals, and I'll explain the question first, then I'll provide the hypothetical information for you, okay?
Okay?
The question which I'll ask you after I provide the hypothetical information is, even if all of the above happened, is it conceivable that cross-contamination occurred between the defendant's reference sample and the Bundy stains during the stain drying process? Okay, that's what the question will be.
Object to the premise.
To rephrase it first, the problem is the word conceivable.
Okay. Well, let me give you the hypothetical, and maybe it'll be easier to do the question then. Let's assume that all the Bundy walkway stains that you saw, 47 through 52, absent or less 51, were seen at midnight by police officers. That the Rockingham stains were seen by police officers at 6 in the morning. That all of these stains were collected with their attached or with their substrate controls on June 13th before the defendant's reference sample was obtained. Furthermore, that all of these evidence stains from Bundy consist of multiple swatches ranging from 4 to 7 individual swatches. That all of these stains were stored in plastic bags along with a plastic bag containing the substrate control in individual coin envelopes, 1 coin envelope per stain. They were put in a truck in the month of June in Los Angeles, where they stayed for several hours. They were ultimately taken back to the Los Angeles Police Department, where they were processed for drying. The stains were processed 1 stain at a time, 1 coin envelope at a time, systematically alternating between the evidence stains and the substrate controls.
I don't have a problem with this hypothetical as being incomplete, given, since I already know where his question's
Counsel,
going.
he hasn't even gotten close to finishing yet, so that objection's premature.
All right.
You were at the systematic
Sure.
alternate processing of the evidence stains and substrate controls.
During the drying process, the defendant's reference sample was brought, before the drying process, the defendant's reference sample was brought into the room, kept in a plastic garbage bag where it remained overnight. The next morning, the stains were dry. They were individually, 1 coin envelope at a time, put into bindles. A separate bindle for the evidence swatches, multiple swatches, a separate bindle for the substrate control, put back into the original coin envelopes, always only working on 1 coin envelope at a time. And furthermore, I'll add the next proviso that ultimately all of the substrate controls tested negative.
Okay.
Okay? Is it possible that the defendant's reference sample could have cross-contaminated any of the evidence based on all of those facts?
I have multiple objections to this hypothetical.
Legal basis.
Legal basis, it's without foundation, and it doesn't address, it only goes up to a certain point in time. Many facts are left out.
Incomplete.
Incomplete. And incomplete and not even...
Incomplete covers it. don't you think?
Incomplete.
All right. Overruled.
Well, as you've described that,
Excuse me just a second. This is not an audience participation function. Next time I hear a reaction from the audience, I'm clearing the audience.
In terms of incomplete, just to be clear about my objection, because I think you asked me some questions, is that incomplete...
Counsel, I'm not asking you to argue the objection.
No, I'm not. I want to be clear that my objection is not just incomplete to the steps up to this point, but incomplete with
Counsel,
respect
I
to
understand.
subsequent steps.
Counsel, I'm not asking you to argue the objection.
All right, I don't mean to argue it, just wanted to make it clear.
Proceed.
as I understand the hypothetical, and one of the keys now is that the blood sample is in that, the reference sample is in a plastic bag. I don't see how that's possible.
And what effect, even though that alone, I think you believe covers it, what effect do the substrate controls not producing typable results have on clearing up any question you might have?
Well, again, they address the cleanliness of the whole process, if you will. In other words, they're showing that where there's no DNA, no blood collected, that we don't get a typing result. So I think that's important.
Okay, Mr. Sims, I want to take that hypothetical. I'm going to start at the beginning again and then take it a little bit further, okay?
Okay?
All the way from the beginning again?
Is that redundant?
All the way from the beginning again, or my question, Your Honor?
Why don't you add your additional factors?
Sure. Do you have everything fresh in mind, that we got you right up to the reference samples in the plastic bag? The next morning, all those swatches are put in coin envelopes.
Okay, so
Put in separate bindles in coin envelopes.
okay, and so now they are in coin envelopes, and then the plastic bag still contains the reference sample.
Right. And these are two separate crime scene stains. Let me add a few other elements to it. From among the stains are two items from Bundy.
We reject at this point that it's woefully incomplete in terms of
Premature counsel overruled.
Two of the Bundy stains which were processed that are not along the walkway produce results which are not consistent with Mr. Simpson, but are consistent with Nicole Brown.
Okay,
They're processed systematically in the sequence of events.
objection with that foundation.
Overruled.
None of the substrate controls processed either during the Rockingham processing or the Bundy processing gave typing results. Okay?
okay,
And furthermore, that the Bundy multiple swatch stains, numbers 47, 48, 50, and 52, were divided at some point after the processing, sent to separate labs, and concurring typing results were produced.
okay.
Okay. Based on all of those factors, is it your opinion, or what is your opinion about the possibility of cross-contamination occurring between the Rockingham samples and the Bundy samples?
Your Honor, objection, incomplete, and I don't know, it's based on testimony. I have to make my objection at the sidebar without, assumes facts not in evidence, and is misleading, extremely misleading and incomplete. And if you want me to explain, I should explain that.
Do you understand all the conditions in there, Mr. Sims?
Yes, I think I do.
Okay, but before you address the bottom line question there, what's the role of these stains from the Bundy walkway? The fact that they consist of multiple swatches, some of them up to 7 individual swatches that were collected, in providing an answer about cross-contamination between the Bundy stains and the Rockingham evidence stains.
Objection. Outside the scope of his own hypothetical, confusing, and inconsistent with the facts.
Overruled. Do you understand the question?
Yes, I do. I think I do, Your Honor. Well, to me, the multiplicity of more than one swatch being around, that would mean that anything that would be contaminating, it would seem unlikely that it would contaminate. In other words, it's unlikely that you'd see one contamination over here, but then you'd get a different result from a swatch that was tested in a different laboratory. In other words, it seems the consistency of the results between laboratories on these multiple swatches suggests to me that those results are valid.
Okay, and what about the...
Answer with respect to the premises of the hypothetical.
Overruled.
Answer a different question.
Overruled.
Okay, and then let's get back to the role that those multiple swatches play, as well as all of the other factors that I provided you in assessing the possibility that there was cross-contamination between any of the Bundy stains and the Rockingham stains.
Okay. So now,
That's not a question.
Sustained.
Ba-
Make
based
it a
on-
good one.
Excuse me.
This is your last question.
Based on the hypothetical information that I've provided to you, do you have, and if so, what is your opinion about the possibility of cross-contamination between the Rockingham stains and the Bundy stains.
Objection, vague as to which hypothetical when.
Overrule.
Yes, my opinion would be that there's certainly no indication that such contamination occurred.
What indication would you look for?
Objection, asked and answered.
Sustained. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take our recess for the evening at this time. And we are also going to take a brief break in the testimony of Mr. Sims. As you recollect, Mr. Sims is from out of town, has some personal matters that he needs to attend to, and he'll be back on the witness stand available, I think, Thursday or Friday. Is that correct? Thursday. All right. Then, Mr. Sims, I'm going to release you at this time, order you not to discuss your testimony with anybody other than the attorneys in the case. You're ordered to return here 8:45 on Thursday.
Okay.
All right, thank you, sir. All right, ladies and gentlemen, please remember all my admonitions to you. Don't discuss the case amongst yourselves, form any opinions about the case. Don't allow anybody to communicate with you. Don't conduct any deliberations until the matter has been submitted to you. We'll stand in recess until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning.